Well, you hear this a lot from scientists. You hear it a lot, in particular, from female scientists. But the fact is that there is some reason to suppose that there is an advantage to being a man in certain subjects. There's reason to suppose that gender essentialism, biological determinism, whatever you want to call it, the fact that there are male brains and female brains, may indeed have some basis in science. Now, this is sort of thrown out of the window completely by feminists and female academics who just refuse to accept that there's any reason whatsoever why there might be a gender imbalance. Two things on that. One, actually the science is very much still out on that. And two, if you look at equality in society, if you look, for example, at Bangladesh versus Norway, what you notice is the number of women in science and technology subjects actually goes down as societies get more equal, because women simply don't make the same choices that female academics and feminists would like them to. Women actually don't want to go into the sciences on the whole, and when they have every option available to them, they tend to choose not to. If you're going to get put off a career in science because of an offhand comment from a Nobel Prize winner, how committed were you really in the first place to being a scientist? Well, it's brilliant being a gay man because you can get away with murder. You can do anything. I mean, there's the one respect in which identity politics is brilliant. You know, as a gay man or a lesbian, you can basically get away with murder. You can be bitchy, you can be sarcastic, you can be rude and abusive, and you can do whatever the hell you like, and nobody complains. Okay, so we have to ask:
girls perform better at university.
You have to ask if this is really a problem. More women are going to university. They're getting higher grades at school. They're getting higher grades at university.
20% of all
more women graduate. Women in their 30s earn more than men for the same work in their 30s in the UK and the US now. They are 2 to 1 more likely to get a job with the same qualifications. Where's the structural bias against women here? I don't see the problem here. What I do see actually is a very reasonable complaint from a lot of young men, not my generation maybe, you know, I'm sort of 10 years older than them, but from a lot of young men who are going to university, going into the workplace, and they don't recognise the world you're describing. But this is based on an assumption that there ought to be some kind of gender parity. My suggestion is that there isn't. We don't complain when women dominate subjects like nursing. We shouldn't complain when men dominate subjects like physics.
I'm not from, well, I mean, Quebec is full of French people, so nothing could be worse than that. But the north of England is probably more like Detroit, maybe, or I don't know, somewhere really barren and hopeless and just sort of
God,
somewhere that's just in managed decline.
Okay.
You know? So I think the most important distinction is really between people who just want to be left alone to enjoy their hobby, consumers and fans of an entertainment medium, and you know, these broken middle class white train wrecks who have decided that the world is broken and they're the only people who can fix it. Well, you know, these things don't even survive a common sense test. They particularly don't survive any kind of critical or academic inquiry. So, you know, you look at people like Christina Hoff Sommers at the American Enterprise Institute, who very effectively and completely demolished most of these claims, whether it's the gender wage gap, which does not exist, whether it's the rape crisis of rape culture on campus, which does not exist. I'm a homo, so I don't really have a I don't have a dog.
I didn't know if you were just English or what.
No, both English and gay. That's why I sound so posh.
Okay, you said you were a homo, so now I have to ask: is the Mariah Carey, is that the gay team jersey for English people like Celine is for the gay people in Quebec?
Yeah, I mean, it's just signaling, really. You know, I mean, I say I like her. I have no idea if I really do. Who knows?
I don't know. Well, you're missing it.
Homosexual. I'm a terrible homosexual. You know, I'm such a failure as a gay man. I grew up watching Star Trek. I'm sorry. No, it's called the cotton ceiling, and it describes the inherent transphobia that all cisgendered people have against transsexuals. It basically is a transgender campaigner's way of saying, if you don't want to have sex with me, you're transphobic. And it's called the cotton ceiling, supposedly because nobody gets past the panties. So we don't cut off the arms of people who wake up one day and say, this arm doesn't belong to me. So we shouldn't warp reality to conform to delusion. We should instead try to help that person reconcile their body with their mind. If you accept, as the left insists that we now do, that you can be born with the wrong gendered brain, that blows out of the water gender as a social construct. And gender as a social construct has been the central linchpin of the majority of left-wing sexual thinking for the last 40 years. If you throw out the idea that gender is a social construct, you throw out the idea of that all gender roles are just performative and learned behavior, and you accept that somebody can be born with the wrong brain, a man can be born with a woman's brain, that upsets the apple cart for the left. More than I can really explain to you in the confines of this program, because what it does, it suggests that all of the wars they've been fighting, all of the sexism stuff they've been talking about, all of the sort of don't tell me I can't behave like X because I'm a woman is rubbish. what it does is suggest that everything that they've been arguing for the last 30 years is total hokum. So the left has got to pick one, because you can't hold both of these positions simultaneously.
Right.
You cannot say there is such a thing as a female brain and at the same time say that all female behavior is learned and is social, and therefore we should stop complaining that about women who don't want to be feminine, and we should say it's okay for men to be metrosexuals and all the rest of it. My view is it isn't. So I'm very tempted by this view. I'm very tempted by this new position that I'm being encouraged into.
That's a very good point.
I mean, aside from the gigantic volumes of domestic violence in lesbian relationships, they're all kicking the crap out of each other all day long.
Lesbians?
Yes. Lesbian relationships. So the statistics on lesbian domestic violence are astonishing.
I believe that entirely from my anecdotal experiences at Bass Pro.
Everybody knows this to be true. Anyone who's ever pretended to enjoy women's football and shown up to a match and seen what they get onto, or seen what they get up to on the pitch. I mean, so anyone who's got a very left-wing friend who's had to go and pretend to find women's football. The dumpstick doesn't lie. I mean, we don't have any good sports. I mean, we have soccer, for God's sake. I mean, we invented a couple of decent things, but no, American national sports by far the best.
Thank you so much for saying that.
Real football, baseball, basketball. Like, I can't get enough of any of them.
Not a soccer fan.
No, God, it's for soccer's for gays. I mean, the matches go on forever. This is so boring. My God, the only reason to watch football is to admire the men, and therefore it mystifies me that the audience is mostly male, because what are they all doing for 90 minutes? It's so boring. No. I can't deal with any of that. I'm American sports all the way. If there's any overarching theme in my work, the Gamergate stuff, the transgender stuff, my primary objection to authoritarian left is that it is profoundly anti-intellectual. It is profoundly and determinately, purposefully stupid. It does not permit discussion and debate of the most interesting and important things in human life, the most important philosophy, the most important politics, the most important stuff that defines us and that helps us to relate to the world around us. It will not have those discussions. That's what I hate about it. That's what I think it really robs ordinary people of. That's what I think is the real objection, aside from any specific stupid argument they make. So homo bears, they sound delicious. They taste a little salty. Like if I wasn't homosexual, I'd be a huge homophobe. I was told my whole life that I was going to experience homophobia, that it was going to be the worst thing that's ever going to happen to me, that that the left was going to protect me. I've never met a homophobe.
Well, they probably cut a wide swath.
Well, I'm sure, but I mean, I don't think I've ever met one. I don't think I've ever been anywhere where somebody has threatened, has wanted to hit me. I don't think it's ever cost me anything in business dealings. I just don't think I've ever met one. Now, granted, I run in fairly civilized circles, but if anything, there are plenty of socially conservative people in those circles who would have problems. I don't think I've ever met a sort of virulently homophobic person.
Well, that's why I say,
I would think it's nonsense. I don't date whites, which I suppose puts me in the really sort of the ultimate conservative sin bin.
You only date black people?
Yeah. So the good news is, if you're redheaded, it is true that fewer people are going to be attracted to you. But the ones that are don't care what you look like.
Exactly.
So you can get fat, and you will always find people who want to fuck you. I don't mind coming out as gay. I don't even mind much more difficult coming out as conservative. But coming out as a Trekkie is a step too far, even for me.
Can you put to rest the myth of the BBC being this beacon of truth and light in news?
Oh, it's hideous. It's a monstrous engine of liberal chaos. Yeah, and there's something of a sort of elderly antiques dealer about that, So
is that a gay thing, antiques?
Yeah. Is that a joke?
I know there's an actual phobia of antiques, more so than homophobia. There's a clinical phobia. Yeah, Billy Bob Thornton.
There's no clinical phobia of antiques. That's ridiculous. It's just attention seeking. And yes, of course, antiques are gay. How many straight people do you know that work in antique shops?
I don't know anybody who works in an antique shop.
Well, if you did, they would be gay. No, I've always wondered about which there are not enough women working in tech. There aren't enough, blacks in this, whatever. I've always wanted to start a petition for heterosexuals on fragrance counters. Why aren't there more straight men selling perfume? It must be because of structural oppression and sort of society's prejudices about what roles men can take in society, mustn't it? Because after all, that's the explanation for all of the other absences in every other industry. So, we've all been there, right? As homosexuals, we've all played the straight, we all sort of tried to pretend to be straight for the first couple of days in a new job, just so that all of the other gays are like, oh, I really want to bang that. And then as soon as they find out you're gay, they're like, oh, okay, whatever, honey. This is what I firmly believe that God made me gay so that I could go for the jugular with feminists, and I've got cover. You know, I firmly believe I was made a homosexual just as cover, just as an identity politics distraction, like a misdirection maneuver, just to throw them at the beginning. So they meet me and they're like, "Oh, it's this nice gay guy. He's going to be fine." And then I'm like, "If facts are wrong," you know, like I could stick up for straight guys in a way they could never stick up for themselves. I have a theory that gay emancipation has made society more stupid, and the reason is as follows.
That's the lead.
Yeah, gay size. I haven't written this up yet, actually, so you can't steal this. So I'm going to write it up at some point.
I shan't.
The reasoning goes something like this: we know that IQ, which for all its faults is still the best measure of intelligence that we have, it's probably the best indicator of future success, and it's a pretty good indicator of whether somebody will perform well in a globalized information economy. It's not a terrible measure of intelligence, right? Is at least 60 to 80% heritable. We also know that gay people, men who identify as homosexual for the majority or for all of their lives, test significantly higher than the rest of the population for IQ. Nobody knows why. We don't know if being gay makes you smarter or being smarter makes you gay, or whether they're just gene clusters that tend to occur together. But what used to happen in the 50s is that gay men would get married, have kids, and then have a double life. They would live their dirty, nocturnal, alternative existence, and they would play house. They would have play happy families during the day. That doesn't happen anymore. What's happened in really the space of just 2 generations is that between 2 and 5% of the smartest men aren't breeding anymore, because they tend to adopt or they tend to have kids from other places. They don't tend to have their own genetic children anymore. And if you believe the upper limit estimates of homosexuality in the population was 4%, something like that, you bear in mind that most women breed, but most men don't. It's quite a significant impact on the hereditary IQ that's moving from generation to generation. And it's one of the many ways in which gay emancipation is, most people would agree, is probably a good thing in most respects. But the fact that gays are now able to, that are liberated and able to live their lives freely and openly, means they breed less now. And as a result, there are a lot fewer of the smartest men having children.
But
it's my debate strategy. You see, you just lay down machine gun fire, and by the end of it, people are just like,
Yeah, as a comedian.
Well, this is part of a broader. It's part of a broader trend. Basically, people don't know anything. People are absolutely wrong about everything.
What?
It would have been unconscionable for me to ever consider hitting a woman when I was growing up. But I see Jessica Valenti on the screen, and don't ever get us in a TV studio together. Even I can't hit. I mean, not saying I want to, but even I wouldn't get away with hitting a woman being gay, because the male privilege would override the homosexual oppression in that particular case. Normally, I can get away with being outrageous and saying unpleasant things and being controversial. Oh, he's just a faggot. But I couldn't do that. So I like to make a joke out of being a sort of homophobic homosexual. So it's kind of like a joke that I do. So I just latch onto any sort of derogatory word for homosexual because it annoys the right kind of gay. There's an earnest, kind of pearl clutching, glad kind of, like, how can you say that about your own people? And then of course they accuse you of being self-loathing and all the rest of it. And I find this sort of stuff endlessly funny. So if anybody's offended by that word, I'm sorry, but well, actually no, I'm not. If anyone's offended,
ironically,
by
that someone is
But even more important than that, we need gender equality so that boys won't be violent. There's a wonderful charity based in Edinburgh called Zero Tolerance, which is teaching gender equality to childminders so that they can teach children that they're equal, they have equal opportunities, and they do it specifically to reduce violence from men to women when they're adults. We need to start much earlier than men.
Okay, Milo, you want to come in?
Unbelievable, astonishing sexism. We have to teach young boys not to be boys so they won't be violent.
Why is being violent being
Get out! I'm sorry. We teach boys and girls that they're the same, and that's a problem. They are different. When we do experiments on young babies and even on related animals, we know that certain children go for certain toys. Boys and girls are different. To give you some context for all of this. you have to understand a little bit about the history of feminism. There have been two main strands.
And here is our local expert.
Well, yes. Of course, because of course men aren't allowed to speak about anything that isn't to do with
no,
men.
the things
Except
that you've
no one's
already
really
said.
interested in.
The things that you've already said indicate that you know nothing about
All right. Well,
it.
I'm going to.
You've already.
I'm going to talk to you a little. I'm going to talk to you a little bit
Kate.
about the problems that men are experiencing in society. And since you're not a man, perhaps you could like to give it a rest for a second. So there is a wider context in which men are suffering slightly. Even 10 years ago, it would have been ridiculous to say it. But very recently, we've seen a lot of structural advantages to being a woman crop up in education, in the workplace. Under 30, women earn more than men for the same work in the UK and the US now, which is an extraordinary statistic and something that people have to be very, very carefully convinced of because it sounds absurd. But there is a sense in which men, particularly young men, probably men our age, haven't necessarily experienced it, but younger men, 20-year-olds, there's an enormous problem. I read about this last year. I call it the sexism of men checking out of society, checking out of relationships, giving up on women, giving up on careers. They don't bother to go to university anymore. Now more women go to university. Women get higher grades at university. More women graduate from university. Yep. All of the traditional imbalances between men and women have flipped, and very recently.
No, that's
and when
incorrect,
young
because
men,
when you go
may I be allowed to
further in the
finish?
business,
Sorry,
that
I'm
is
talking
not
about men, darling.
And you call me darling? How incredibly rude. And now you think it's funny. Well, this is exactly the problem. This is institutionalised sexism, and you're just sitting here doing it flagrantly and without even apologising.
Well, we just heard that it was an essential characteristic of men that they were violent a minute ago. So
no,
I guess
we did not. Nobody
that's exactly what
that.
she said. So it's now open season, particularly if you're white and you're a man. And what feminists don't seem to appreciate the irony of is that they are relentlessly ridiculing people on the basis of skin colour and sex, and they don't seem to get the irony there.
For our lesbian friends, or any men in the audience, or as I like to call them, eunuchs, you might like to consider scissor fingers, which is a fairly simple one. You have to kind of lift it up in the air to really get the full effect, but basically you just sort of lean back a little bit and just do this. Finally, a perennial feminist favourite, something you won't even have to teach your audience. It's finger wagging.
I think it's pretty clear, unfortunately, that it comes down to an issue of personal responsibility. No cloud service is ever going to be completely secure. Apple does have a responsibility to make its software as secure as possible, but there will always be hackers who are much smarter and much cleverer and much more determined to exploit vulnerabilities. What this boils down to, for celebrities just like everybody else, is personal responsibility. And if you're going to take pictures of yourself like that, by far the most intelligent thing to do is do it with a Polaroid. Don't do it on a device that's connected to the internet, that's sending your pictures to servers you don't control. It's a recipe for madness, and for somebody who is as rich and as famous as Jennifer Lawrence is, it's sort of unbelievable.
It's really weird, isn't it? I mean, we keep hearing about all of these extraordinary hate crimes that happen everywhere, but it doesn't really, I don't think, reflect the Britain that most of us know and love. The problem really, I think, is that there's a whole ecosystem of publicly funded think tanks and university departments and all the rest of it, all set up to find prejudice somewhere to justify their own existence. I mean, it doesn't reflect the country that I know, and I don't think it reflects most people's experiences of being gay. Well, I grew up in a very small village in Kent, and I can tell you that actually, people who live in the country, who grow up in, in rural places in England, are some of the most tolerant, some of the most welcoming, some of the loveliest people in the country. In fact, it's in the city that I have personally experienced more, oppression or victimization, because I don't think they really exist in Britain anymore, but certainly where I've experienced the most problem for being gay. And ironically, it's not really for being gay at all. It was much more difficult to come out as a Tory voter being gay than it was, my sexuality in the first place. And that was a result of a sort of gay establishment, which is now using very much the same sort of, tactics that they say that they were subjected to themselves over decades. I don't think it really reflects Britain. And I think, it's easy to get caught up in the hysteria and drama about, homophobia. It's not really a problem anymore in this country, in the same way that it's patronising and out of date to say that women are some sort of oppressed minority or oppressed underclass in this country. It simply isn't true anymore. Well, I lived in a small community and I was noticeably different. I remain noticeably different. The problem with hate crimes, first of all, is they're far too broadly defined. Second of all, it's a sort of Orwellian attempt to get inside the minds of people involved in altercations and work out what their real motivations were. And thirdly, in fact, it sort of destroys the concept of equality before the law, because effectively what hate crime means is it's more of a crime to hit let's say, me, than it would be to hit you, which is something that I think most of your viewers would probably disagree with the principle of. You know, it's an absurd thing to try to get into the minds of people, work out what they were really motivated by and what they were really doing. And this is the problem we're seeing at the moment in the US with the shooter, this terrible atrocity in Charleston. People trying to get into his mind and work out what he was really motivated by. The fact is, we'll never know. He was crazy. Lots of people get into fights all the time, but if you provide people with this ready-made victimhood script, they're quite willing. They will be quite willing to use it. And unfortunately, gay people do get into fights, and when they get into fights, they, you know, have a habit of crying foul and crying homophobia in the same way that, unfortunately, lots of other kinds of minorities have sort of been trained into doing as well, because they know it gets results. Like every sort of rightsist movement in its death throes, the discussion gets ever more hysterical and focused on ever smaller things. So if you look at sort of the gender war, you look at modern feminism, they start to focus on ever more tiny things, but ever more hysterically. So we see, for example, obsession over transgender pronouns to the point of hysteria and mania, to the point of pursuing people if they don't use them properly. We see, you know, discussion about manspreading, which is this thing in New York. Apparently men sit with their legs too wide on the tube, and it's spoken about with an extraordinary sort of ferocity and hatred, like this was something that actually mattered. I mean, never mind the women who put their handbags and shopping on the seats. You know, this sort of weird, obscure, tiny stuff that is spoken about enormously angrily is the sign of a movement in its death throes, panicking because it's worried about perpetuating its own existence. Well, the Office for National Statistics figures are based on 1% of an average right the way across the industry, so they don't take into account the different kinds of jobs people are doing, so really they're effectively meaningless. But there's a very simple question that demonstrates why this the whole debate is nonsense and why the pay gap is a ridiculous sort of fabrication. And it's this: if women are doing the same work for less money, why aren't companies full of women? Why aren't employers going out actively seeking women? Well, they don't, and they don't for some of the same reasons that that, you know, women take different sorts of roles and different part-time roles. Women don't work as long hours as men do, even if they don't have children. They take longer holidays. They don't make as much money for their firms. They don't work the same overtime. So we can't really expect them to be compensated the same as men when they don't work as hard. Now, that's not, you know, I don't mean that to sound, you know, unkind about women. Women simply have different priorities in life. Most women want a more balanced life. They want time with their family. They want to do hobbies. They want more time away on holiday. They don't want to put in the work that those sort of obsessive, aggressive, you know, sort of goal-oriented male professions sometimes demand. The law, for example. Women just aren't really interested in devoting their whole life to work in that way. And the very broad brush figures from the ONS simply reflect that. What they don't show is that a woman going to the workplace is going to be paid less than a man for the same. In fact, under the age of 35 in the UK and the US, women are paid more in the same sorts of roles, and they're 2 to 1 more likely to get jobs in science and maths because employers are so desperate to hire women.
No, it doesn't matter in the sense that they are equal but different, but it simply isn't true to say that there is no difference whatsoever between the aptitudes of men and women. And it is, without question, true that there are some biological differences between men and women, and we know that from our anatomy. But we also know it from experiments that we do on young children before they've had the opportunity to be socialised, the sorts of toys that they go for. And that holds true, actually, for other bits of the animal kingdom as well. Some of the reason why girls drop out of STEM subjects at college and chess clubs is because they keep losing. And one of the reasons they keep losing is that it does seem to be the case that chess as a game plays to some of the male intellectual virtues. And when Simon Baron-Cohen talks about these, the way he describes it is men are good at systematizing and women are good at empathizing. And there is some reason to suppose that that may have some basis in biology. It's very trendy these days to say that everything is socially determined, but that's not what the science says. And it's not either what common sense says, because if it were true, these days there would be a lot more representation of women in the sciences, in astrophysics, in philosophy, in mathematics, and in chess, but there isn't.
We're into sort of, you know, broader left-wing territory here, where the educational maintenance allowance, the EMA, i.e. bribing children to go to school,
well, hang on, what about the comments on...
you just described as a basic right, which I think most ordinary people would find ridiculous.
Okay, what about race?
I mean, you know, those of us who perhaps have right-of-centre views, but are under, you know, no stretch of the imagination racism. In my dating history looks like a, you know, a Benetton catalogue. You know, I'm not a racist person, but I do think that there is some... I can understand people who are concerned that sexism and racism legislation, when it gives rise to positive discrimination, affirmative action, quotas and stuff like that, unfairly discriminates against certain groups of people. And I just don't accept the argument that Britain's racist.
Okay, let me...
Well, it's extraordinary, isn't it, to hear about, the fact that there's apparently a problem with women worrying about being too thin. That's, of course, not the problem. The problem is that everyone's getting too fat. And actually, there's no evidence, really, that any of this stuff has much of an impact. A lot of the science is very fuzzy on this. It's social science stuff rather than any real sort of reports or anything. I mean, what worries me about all of this kind of stuff is the implication that somehow we're going to make people's lives happier or better by encouraging them to believe that whatever body shape they are and whatever they look like, they're beautiful and they're going to be happy. That's evident. That's quite clearly not the case. I mean, if you look at women's happiness has been going down since the Second World War. Actually, every decade, but women are getting more miserable as they get told that they can be who they want and look how they like. And you can say, I suppose, that a woman's self-esteem should have nothing to do with whether or not a man's sexual preference, sort of coincides with how she looks. But the fact is, women are getting more unhappy, and this sort of slightly irresponsible trend to sort of encourage people to eat whatever they want and do whatever they want is is one of the things that's fueling an obesity crisis, and that's a really serious thing. That's a real thing. That's something that's got health implications. It's got cost implications for the NHS. The problem isn't too many anorexic women. The problem is quite in the opposite direction. We're perfectly happy to have aspirational role models in our entertainment. We should have them too in our retail. There's nothing wrong with encouraging people to live healthily. I'm not sure where this sort of obsession with realism and realistic proportions has come from. I mean, there are blogs, sort of feminist blogs out there that show, video game characters in more realistic proportions. They turn Lara Croft into this sort of dumpy, lesbianic, short woman in cargo pants, and nobody really wants to see that. Nobody wants, not even women. It's not an aspirational sort of icon that people can aspire to be like. The fact is, we do have a huge problem with people treating their own health very irresponsibly. And I personally find when media figures and feminists and activists and campaigners encourage women to worship themselves no matter what their size and what their shape, actually that just has the effect of making women unhappy. And women have been getting more unhappy decade after decade after decade since the Second World War, since this stuff started to happen. I'm not sure that's the case. I think it's quite an important part of growing up, that sort of as people start to experiment with dangerous language, they argue with each other, they position themselves against other people, and if you provide them with these enormous words on mainstream TV news stations, because you've written in national newspapers these awful naughty words, what's a kid going to do? Use it.
I'm going to read out something you wrote about homosexuality, which is the feelings of alienation and rejection it engenders are responsible for the sorts of repugnant tribal posturing you see on the streets of Soho on a Friday night, as bitterly unhappy queers engage in degrading and repulsive behaviour.
I stand by that.
It's OK.
I'm really not that much of a homosexual. I mean, I don't even like them. I don't like them. If I were straight, I would be the biggest homophobe. I swear. I don't even like them very much. I'm not a libertarian because a lot of my friends are libertarians. So many of my friends and colleagues are libertarians. But I sort of think it's all well and good until you realise that actually it'd be better if your daughter did not grow up to be a crack whore. And the other thing about libertarians is on the whole, libertarians are such children. They're obsessed with two things. They're obsessed with weed and hacking. And all they ever want to hear about is where the next eighth is coming from and Edward bloody Snowden. This is all they have to talk about. All they want to talk about, weed and hacking, weed and hacking. I mean, they're sort of perpetually 17. It drives me insane. I mean, libertarianism is some great intellectual, philosophical sort of history and heritage of this movement, classicalism, J.S. Mill and all the rest of it. And all they want to talk about is weed and hacking. And it just drives me up the wall because there's some really useful and interesting things that they could say about the proper limits of government, but they never do. I'm guessing that you, Dean, are not obsessed with weed or hacking, but no. But this is the impression I always get from libertarians. I'm more sceptical about same-sex marriage, mostly because I think it makes homosexuals really boring. I mean, the only good thing about being gay was, it was being able to sort of break all the rules, stumble out of a club bleary-eyed at 4 p.m. on a Monday afternoon, and nobody could judge you. There was a good thing about being gay. It's not gay marriage. They want us to. This is just society's way of controlling dissident subcultures. They just want us to sort of settle down, get a house and a car and adopt a child and have a terrible 9-to-5 job and become just like everyone else. I mean, being gay, grow up being gay, it's pretty awful. It's pretty, it's confusing. You feel, miserable half the time. I've never been the victim of any sort of unpleasantness, but generally it's not a sort of happy way to be. Your reward for that is for the rest of your life you get to behave terribly and nobody can say anything. This sort of gay marriage is incredibly depressing. I think it's awful for gay culture in general has become so sort of bourgeois and depressing and miserable. So I'm not a fan of that. And when you see things like the Memories Pizza, these sort of poor pizza shop owners who get hectored and pilloried and bullied into closing down their store because they don't want to make a cake for lesbians. I mean, who would endorse lesbian marriage? You know what the domestic violence rate is for lesbians? I mean, it's
I don't.
But crap out of each other they beat the crap out of each other all the time. I mean, I can well imagine if I owned a cake shop. I'm not making you a cake. It's just going to end up on her face. You look at the statistics on lesbian domestic violence. You can look up an article that I wrote for Breitbart, which is called "Attack of the Killer Dykes," and basically you look. I'm just making your life worse. No, I'm sorry. Basically, the culture wars which we're familiar with, feminists and, authoritarians of all stripes who want to clamp down on creative freedom, tell people that art forms make people sexist and violent and racist and all the rest of it. No evidence for any of this. It's all crazy. Finally, these wars arrived in video games last year. And so gamers, unlike any other fandom, unlike comic books, fantasy, sci-fi, all of whom have toppled over and taken it and started self-flagellating about, what an awful, diversityless, terrible, straight, white, male, patriarchal kind of pursuit this is. Gamers said, you know what, actually, no, wait, you're wrong about this. We're hugely diverse. We're very welcoming. There is no evidence that video games make anybody more violent, more sexist, or anything else. Get out of our hobby. We're not interested in your political warfare in something that we love, which we do precisely to escape from this kind of nonsense in the rest of the world. And so that's basically it. It's a sort of pitched battle between ordinary gamers on the one hand, and on the other, the ranked masses of the media, all of whom bought this line about them being misogynistic losers, feminist sort of critics and academics, and basically the whole establishment. And on the virtuous side was gamers and me. I never call them back in the morning. Don't spread scandalous lies. Rick Perry, I would say, total homo.
Really? No, okay, I wasn't going to end Rick Perry. Now you're going off. I was going to say Al Gore. I've always thought Al Gore was gay.
Oh, no. He's so unfashionable. No. He has no personal style whatsoever. He has nothing. I mean, Rick Perry's got a certain swagger. Rick, you can sort of tell Rick might, maybe. No, but Al Gore is way too unfashionable to be homosexual. We will not accept him. We will not have him. He's not getting in.
Hillary Clinton. What do you think? You think she could...
Do I think she's a lesbian?
Yeah.
Ooh, well, you know what? She's got that sort of cold steel behind the eyes that a lot of them have, hasn't she? She's got the terrible...
She's got the devil's eyes.
One size too small. No, do you know what I mean? That sort of dead fish eyes, Yeah. They're just sort of, or maybe bird eyes. They're just
doll's
sort of, there's something of the ineffable, the sort of endless abyss behind those eyes of cold, dark sociopathy. And it's sort of you see quite often in lesbians. So, I don't know, maybe. I don't know where this idea ever came from. Gays and lesbians get along, we like each other. We hate each other. No,
like werewolves and vampires.
Yeah.
It's just, right. Yeah, I mean, the lesbians and housewarming gifts are always very dangerous. You give her the verbena instead of the vanilla. I mean, bad. You'll end up served for dinner. They're scary people. What was worse about it is, I mean, it's and this is Gavin McInnes's point. She said, cut that out, sir. You're going home in an ambulance. Nobody goes home in ambulances. That's like your ambulance takes you home. Your ambulance takes you home. Something has gone wrong.
You're going to go home in a hearse, little guy.
I mean, it's Gavin McInnes's joke, but it's a good point.
Good joke.
Well, some people say that transgenderism is a psychiatric disorder that ought to be in the DSM somewhere near, for example, bipolar and narcissistic personality disorder.
Yeah.
And they get very upset when you say this, but just look at the prominent transsexuals, and even not prominent. If you happen to know any in personal life, I know one. And tell me that they don't have a touch of NPD about them. I mean, these people crave attention more than they crave surgery. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. They do seem broken that way. What worries me more is that we're creating this sort of privileged class of victims, I think, in America, where if you belong to a particular group or you have a certain disease, you can basically get away with saying anything. So there's a satirist, a great satirist called Godfrey Elfwick, who's a sort of social media satirist, and he takes the piss out of feminists. Anyway, he's absolutely great, and you must follow him. But he tweeted her because he likes to go to sort of very left-wing celebrities, pretending to agree with their points of view. So they sort of get locked into conversation, and then he drops bomb on them. But he referred to Ben Shapiro as a neo-Nazi, or to refer to his supporters as neo-Nazi, and she replied, "Agree." And you're like, hang on a second. I'm pretty sure when you had your hand around his shoulder, I saw a yarmulke. I'm pretty sure he's not a neo-Nazi. Just going to throw that out there. If somebody else called a prominent Jewish journalist a neo-Nazi, I mean, you can't even imagine what the result would be. The trajectory of pressure is only ever in one direction, and that's because, for example, the same people who want all of women to be allowed into men's spaces and want to be able to take over men's sports are the same people who are complaining that women's football is less highly remunerated. Well, it's less highly remunerated because it's incredibly fucking dull, enormously boring.
I disagree with you. I hate soccer, but I think soccer is a woman's sport. It's just the same as the men, so it's a wash to me.
Well, I agree with you. In general, it is a sport for girls. But there are boy girls and girl girls, and the boy girls are faster and better, and they make more money, and that's perfectly reasonable. But you never see people who want boys injected into girls' sports. Of course they don't. You know about the hockey thing, right? Like the American women's Olympic hockey team plays high school hockey teams and loses. High school boys hockey team and loses. They consider it to be really tough preparation for the Olympic competitions. The women's Olympic hockey team play like high school boys and lose, but they think that's basically the best team they can find to play against.
And that's it's
called testosterone.
It's a ring full of
but I didn't believe that when I first read it, but it's absolutely true.
My son is 15, so I clearly have had sex at least once.
At least once. This is true.
You've broken my heart.
Milo was just hoping.
I was sure he was a homosexual. I mean, did you see that outfit? Did you see the outfit? And come on, Terry Hatcher is a gay guy's idea of what a beautiful woman is like. She's absolutely beautiful. But if a gay man was asked to describe the most beautiful woman in the world, he would describe Terry. I mean, that's what it is. She has so many gay fans from Desperate Housewives, and they're all homosexual. So obviously, the outfit, the spandex, Terry Hatcher, clearly gay. But no. No. See, it's my teenage gaydar was not as refined then as it is now.
Yeah.
I've taken some time out of my busy schedule, being fabulous and doing my hair, to prepare a speech for you. Well, a few remarks, really. Feminism is cancer. Thank you very much.
What Milo meant to say is that feminism, while being a noble and valiant, courageous movement, there are certain schools of thought that are somewhat unwholesome. Right, Milo?
No, I meant it was cancer. And if you feel particularly excited on any given occasion, you can use sizzle fingers, which I like to do something like this. Which is the tearing away of the old patriarchal superstructure and the replacement of it with whatever the fuck you guys believe in.
Please, let's refrain from making interruptions and allow our guest to speak.
Oh, by the way, sorry, I did forget to mention one thing. For every unscheduled interruption, going back to the beginning of this show, I'm going to give $50 to the Donald Trump campaign. And, sorry, I just forgot to mention it. And $50 to the Yiannopoulos privilege grant. So thank you to the interrupters. The interrupters are helping to send white boys to college, so thanks so much. Political correctness describes a sort of organized system of lying, designed to save the feelings of delicate wallflowers at the expense of reason, fact, and truth. And political correctness at its most dangerous has even become deadly. Political correctness is what stopped people reporting the Fort Hood shooter, even though they knew he was into radical Islam. Political correctness is what stopped the police. It's what stopped the police arresting the rape Okay, if you don't believe in anything else...
Could we please allow our guest speaker to go on without any interruptions? Thank you.
If you don't care about anything else, allow me to suggest to you that you might care about the rape of 1,400 young girls, and perhaps listen to the end of it and see what you think about it. Political correctness was what prevented, or at least retarded, the police and the government from arresting Pakistani rape gangs in Rotherham in the UK. Over the course of 10 years, these familial Muslim rape gangs raped 1,400 young girls. And they weren't stopped, even though the police knew what was going on, because of political correctness, the fear of being seen as racist. So it's a sort of, for me at least, it steps outside beyond the realms of etiquette, beyond the realms of politeness strategies, the way we deal with other people from other cultures, and it becomes a kind of organized, systematic lying designed to save some feelings at the expense of reason, logic, truth, and very often the rights and safety of others. And not the kind of social justice safety, the horse shit safety, the kind of, you know, when students say, Milo Yiannopoulos is a threat to my physical safety, grow the fuck up. What's threatening your physical safety? Are you worried I'm going to drop some pearls and you'll trip over them, you fucking idiots? No. But there is a kind of real sense in which political correctness in its most extreme forms has become dangerous to the rights, freedoms, and physical safety, and even the life of others. That's the difference between political correctness and etiquette. Thank you.
Just moving on here.
I got to tell you.
Sorry, I hope I wasn't revealing anything there.
I don't know why Black Lives Matter even protests me. I've got more black in me than they do. No, I don't agree that bigoted speech is always a bad thing. I think it's important to hear from them. I think it's important to hear from them. You see, what the left wants to do is it wants to enable its extremists on its own side, the sexists and misandrists of the feminism, the black supremacists of Black Lives Matter. They want to enable the extremists on their own side and silence the extremists on the other. Well, I don't like the extremists on either side. Racists, I don't like them, and they don't like me. I'm a miscegenatory, gay Jew. They don't like me at all. But what I want to do is give a platform to all speech. I want more speech of all kinds. Why? I'll explain to you in one very simple example why that's the case. A very successful example of this was the British National Party in the UK, which unlike UKIP, for instance, which is a perfectly respectable mainstream party, the British National Party was a racist party led by a very odious character called Nick Griffin. Now, for a long time, the British National Party was doing very well, out of anxiety about, understandable, I think, anxiety about immigration and the changing nature of local communities. Lots of people started voting BNP in Britain. Now, these people weren't racist and bigots. They were voting out of anxiety and frustration. So here's what happened. Here's what happened when the media embargo, if you like, was lifted on the leader of the BNP. Nick Griffin appeared on the BBC's Question Time for 1 hour. This was at a time in which the BNP was controlling some local councils. They had successfully stood for election and won overall control of some local councils in Britain. Quite an extraordinary and not a particularly proud moment in British history. But the day Nick Griffin appeared on Question Time, and the BBC was criticized mercilessly for giving this guy a platform. This is hate speech, this is bigotry, he's a racist, how dare you put this man on TV? The BNP...
Oh, that was a clever one.
What happened, of course, as anyone with any brains would be able to predict, was that the BNP evaporated. When British people saw what the guy who ran this party was really like, they stopped voting for that party. A couple of years later, the BNP is no longer a force in British politics. This is why it isn't just important to give platforms to ordinary speech, it's important to give platforms to all speech. Because sunlight is the best disinfectant, and the best way to deal...
Absolutely.
The best way to deal with people that you don't agree with, whether they are conservatives or progressives, is the full glare of the spotlight, because you should have the confidence in your own opinions, and you should have the fortitude and courage to believe that you can beat them in a fair, open marketplace of ideas. And if you believe those things...
Absolutely right.
If you believe those things... you have nothing to fear from any speaker. Because not every black person agrees with Black Lives Matter. Not every gay person believes in the gay lobby. Not every woman is a feminist. And this kind of identitarian politics that we heard from the front, that crucifies people who step outside of their racial or sexual groups because they have the wrong ideology is the worst sort of bigotry. I am stunned by the indecorousness, rudeness, and plain lack of courtesy and respect shown to respected speakers by the left, and I see nothing even remotely comparable on the libertarian side or on the conservative side. The level of rudeness shown to your fellow audience members and to respected professors is so shocking to me. And it is not, look, I go on Twitter and I go on Twitter and I do polls that say, would you rather your child had A, feminism, or B, cancer? Now, in the case of that poll, 22,000 people voted, and they voted in favor of cancer, 55-45. I had people writing to me saying, my mum just died of cancer, and I still voted cancer. I had people come to me saying, I'm a 2-time cancer survivor, and I still voted cancer. So I can understand why you might want to come and be rude to me, because I can take it, and I'm a provocateur, and I'm not going to do what you do, which is cry the victim afterwards. What I don't understand, and I have never understood, is the level of outright rudeness displayed to a classy lady who is coming here with facts and evidence to challenge your sloppy thinking. I've never understood it, and it speaks so poorly of you. And I just got a word of warning before I pass back. This is the year, just one word of warning for you guys. This is the year the public starts to see these videos. My college tour is penetrating way outside the media that is normally interested in this stuff. Your parents are going to start pulling you from college if you keep this shit up. They will not donate to these schools. Look at what has happened at Missouri. And I'll tell you something. You privileged, spoiled brats who come from nice middle-class families. Daddy pays your phone bill. Daddy bought you a car. Daddy pays your college fees. Not my daddy, your daddy. Not him. He wouldn't pay your fucking fees. I wonder what's going to happen when your parents see some of this stuff. Because let me tell you, the feedback so far from my tour has been abject horror. And I'll give you one data point, and that is Missouri, which bought into the worst kind of race-baiting, hoaxing, and lying from the student body. What has happened at Missouri? I'll tell you, 2 things have happened at Missouri. They have lost tens of millions of dollars in alumni donations, and enrollment is down so much. Enrollment is down so much, they've had to close 2 dorms. Do you know what those dorms are called? Strength and excellence. These are the things you lose when you buy into social justice. It's funny, you know, I mean, liberals and the progressive left have run campuses almost unopposed for 30 years, and now liberals are telling us that spaces run by liberals are hotbeds of sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, and rape. Maybe it's time to switch things up in the faculty. Black communities keep voting in Democrat mayors and see their cities reduced to rubble. Maybe it's time for a Republican. The left for 30 years has been so lazy, they haven't really had to make arguments. They've just said, oh, don't listen to him, he's a misogynist. Don't listen to her, she's got internalized misogyny. It isn't going to work anymore. These slogans don't work now. Nobody believes you. It doesn't stop the events from happening. You're not persuading anyone in the audience. It doesn't work anymore. I'm a Brit. I don't even vote here. Christina is a Democrat. We have no more love from the authoritarian religious right in the 90s who, for instance, were saying that video games could make you violent and prompted school shootings. Bollocks. Than we do for the progressives today who say video games can make you sexist. Also bollocks. What we believe in is the free, open exchange of ideas. And if you believe in an open marketplace of ideas, creative freedom, intellectual diversity, today your enemy is the progressive left. There is no alternative. Islam is a set of ideas, and like any other set of ideas, we are perfectly entitled to interrogate it and find it wanting. I personally find it wanting. I would also like to say, as a gay person, I am fucking terrified by mass Muslim immigration because the homophobia in the Islamic community, in the Ummah, is not restricted to terrorists. It is not restricted to ISIS. 51% of British Muslims believe that gay sex should be against the law. This is not Muslims in Syria. This is not Muslims in Raqqa. This is Muslims who live 3 streets away from me. Every other one of them believes that my lifestyle should be illegal. 39% of British Muslims believe that a woman should always obey her husband. Where the fuck are feminists on that? 25%. 25% of British Muslims believe that Sharia law should be instituted, which under certain circumstances treats a woman's...
Milo, he's trying to narrow in on a question.
Well, I'm going to finish. Treats a woman's testimony as worth half of a man's. The Queers for Palestine, possibly the stupidest people to walk the face of the earth, overlook the statistic that 97% of Palestinians believe that homosexuality is an unacceptable lifestyle choice. I'm not scared by terrorists, I'm scared by Islam. Students who go to study gender studies, particularly at federal-funded universities, come out dumber than when they went in. They come out believing lies. They come out with their critical faculties impaired, not improved. They come out more fragile than they arrived. They come out less able to have stable relationships with people, less able to cope in the world of work, less able to be functional, well-rounded human beings. Gender studies departments are damaging young people. They should be shut down. I'd like to build on what Christina said. I mean, most of the people causing trouble in this room are, what, 20 years old? You don't know anything. You don't know anything. So I would encourage, and I don't mean that to be offensive, although, you know, if you take it as that, I don't give a shit. But why not try, you mentioned Socrates earlier, why not try one of the great virtues of the Greek philosophers, intellectual humility? Why not consider the possibility that somebody else might have something to add to your view of the world? Why not consider the possibility, the radical notion, that you could be wrong?
Now,
it's an amazing loss of perspective. You know, you have these advocacy statistics about the supposed explosion of Islamophobia, which, you know, basically always boils down to hijab pulling. Like people forgotten 9/11. I mean, are you people too young to remember that you know, buildings were brought down in New York, Belgium a couple of weeks ago, Paris a few months before that, and you're worried about a bit of hijab pulling? Get a fucking grip.
And young men are suffering at precisely the kind of sociopathic, ugly third-wave feminism which is running rampant on campuses. It is responsible. Is it a violation of safe space policy to criticise the safe space policy? There is a very clear brain difference between men and women. Men and women think differently. They have different aptitudes. When a feminist tries to convince you, for example, that the reason there aren't more women in STEM subjects is there's some sort of mystical, patriarchal energy, sorry for mystical, what they're trying to do is tell you that gender is a performance and a construct, and that there can be no biological basis for the differences between men and women. That's insane.
And my boyfriend is much better with children, fiancé, is much better with children than I am, and I am much better at, I'm much more aggressive than he is. So surely all not in all aspects of life.
I don't know what she's trying to tell us. I'm completely lost.
Do you see what I'm trying to say about all these characteristics that are gendered? Different people have different characteristics that are gendered differently.
Oh, I see. No.
Things that aren't real, unicorns, and free stuff generally. Thing that is real, pay gap. No. Your issue but averaging it out is the best way to understand how it generally affects people.
No, it isn't, because it confuses wages and earnings.
Okay, I sense we need to be economists to answer this line of thought, so let's just proceed to...
Before we actually come to a conclusion.
Okay, but that's not
why bother discussing them, for God's sake? I mean, the two big issues are the pay gap and campus rape culture. We're seeking to establish whether or not we live in a society of equality.
Okay,
those are the two big issues. If we can't get down to... I mean, we're in an
Mr. Yiannopoulos, may I stop you there for a second? Okay. I do not object to trying to find an answer to the question of whether or not there is a wage gap. I just felt the manner in which it was approached was perhaps not going to give us useful answers because we were discussing laws of averages amongst other things. Because many of the audience are not familiar with it. Can you suggest, perhaps, a different way of resolving this question?
What about longer hours? Why don't we talk about working harder or
not? Yes, but can you suggest we find it here now?
Shall we talk about this working harder, longer hours thing to get off arguing about arguing?
No, we have an economic question with an economic answer, and I don't understand why I'm not allowed to give it.
You have given the answer. You've said
Well, I didn't part of it, and I got interrupted twice. I don't understand why I'm not allowed to give it.
However,
the question was why, if women are cheaper, and this is what I was trying to explain, this is a conflation between wages and earnings. Because when you tell a woman, as feminists do, that after November the whatever, you're effectively working for free for the rest of the year, what she hears is, I'm paid 77 cents to a male dollar, or whatever, right? This is based on the conflation of wages and earnings. No woman is paid less for the same work as a man. That's illegal. And if they were, yes, companies would be full of them. Women don't apply for jobs at the same rates as men. It wouldn't matter. Employers would hire the women anyway because they're cheaper. It doesn't make any difference. And frankly, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny either. Because if you start looking at studies that are coming out now, Cornell, 2015, women going into STEM subjects have a 2-to-1 advantage over men going for the same jobs. Fewer women do apply, but they all get the jobs. Again, you have to explain, if you believe that the number of women in STEM subjects is too low because women are not being encouraged to do science subjects, there aren't enough women in physics and maths and philosophy, you have to explain why women dominate biology, why women dominate medicine.
Because of the girly sciences.
What does that mean?
They're the sciences that are more linked to caring professions.
I don't think you should make generalisations like that. Some people find that kind of offensive.
There's a caring aspect to those when you're working. They're the kind of nurturing. That's not what I said. That's not fair. That's not very nice thing to say about men, though. They are the sciences that lend themselves to more caring professions. Therefore,
women are more caring than men.
By caring, what do you mean by caring?
As in the more...
It's just sexism.
No, please let her finish.
Women are more caring than men.
I'm saying this. I'm not condoning it. I'm saying it's the way it is.
Women are more caring than men, is your
No,
position.
that's not at all what I'm saying.
Okay, please let her
Women are
define what
perceived to be more suited to caring professions.
So a woman will apply for biology because women are perceived to be more caring than men.
I mean, you made it, yeah. I mean, good to be understanding it, but yeah.
Okay, let's take another question.
Men do all of the difficult, dangerous, and deadly jobs. Workplace fatalities are 97% male. Men do all the jobs women don't want to do. You never hear a woman complaining that there aren't enough female steeplejacks, or people who drive oil trucks, or people who engineer oil rigs in the North Sea, or people who get down and or people who haul feces around on farms. You never hear about that stuff because that represents a male underclass that feminism doesn't want to talk about. And it's the male underclass that keeps our society ticking. It is the people who built this building. It is the people who make sure the electricity reaches your home. It is the people who, who build up the roads under our feet. Women don't want to do those jobs, and they don't care about the men who do.
Okay, do you accept that generally more female circumcision is done in a non-medically sterile environment?
Yes,
I have no clue.
Okay.
I don't think you do either.
I think
Actually, you have evidence of this? You're convinced of this?
I'm convinced this from studies that I've read, but...
Okay, very well. So there is evidence. The studies will be applied up.
Amnesty International's genital mutilation...
says that female circumcision happens in less sanitary conditions than men.
If you read the whole thing, that's the impression I took from it.
The impression you took from it.
Hold on a second, right. We're returning to an evidence-based debate. All this evidence will be uploaded up. Is that correct?
We don't want evidence-based debates. We can't have that.
Okay.
You keep attacking Rebecca's work quite personally, and you said that she likes to objectify men, but she doesn't like women being objectified. She actually wrote an article how she didn't like Brooklyn Beckham being called something like young, sexy, and legal, and how she thought that it was wrong that he was called that by another article. So that clearly shows that she doesn't like.
Well, I never said she was consistent, but she did write an article in the wake of the Charlotte Proudman issue, and there was a lawyer who decided she didn't want to be a lawyer anymore, she wanted to be a Guardian columnist, so she made a name for herself by complaining that a man had said she looked nice. Well, I'm sorry, love. So she went to town, publicly shamed him.
I suspect this is verging the rounds of ad hominem attacks.
I am really interested to hear where you're going there, because I don't think I read it.
In your piece, you said that if it was a man, you'd probably have laughed. Do you want me to quote it?
I'm genuinely, yes, I would, because I'm not saying you're wrong, I just don't remember writing it.
Okay. I'll find it while you're recording.
After this one last question, just to clarify.
Yeah, it was, if I knew that a male member of staff was speculating about how I look naked, I would cause the sort of fuss that would make Charlotte Proudman look meek. If I heard a female colleague doing the same thing about Andrew in accounts, I'd probably laugh and I might even join in.
And I completely right. And do you know what? I think the fact that I would say something like that, I think that is men, and I should not have said that.
Well, you know, the funny thing is, I wrote a column saying nobody wants to live in a world of uncircumcised penises, but I'll be clear, that's because I have to suffer and most men reading don't. Anytime you hear the word problematic, it means that science has gone out the window. This is sort of man-woman thing, right? Men actually do cost-benefit analysis quite often. It can seem a bit cold, but, you know, men are like, is it worth it to me? Like, if I do this and I get this, great. Like, if I get married, I'll get plenty of sex, but, I don't know. Men do those kind of cost-benefit analyses. Women very often are a little bit more feelings-led. Some of you in the room won't like that observation. I think it holds broadly true. Men have done the cost-benefit on relationships these days and found women lacking. They have found women do not offer a good deal, if you want to put it like that. So they're checking out. I spend most of my life either in my living room writing or on campuses that everybody knows who spends time in universities in the UK and in the US, which you know, everybody knows.
We can't verify that everybody
It's called a soft quantifier. Perfectly well understood in logic. It is generally understood. You know, if you actually spend time on campuses these days, you know what men say. Men say, you know, the widening definition of sexual assault done by universities after pressure from progressives and feminists, the widening of the classification of sexual assault to include unwanted advances makes them feel awkward about approaching women. If you approach a woman in a nightclub and she turns you down, that is, according to the sexual harassment policy of most British universities, and all the Russell Group universities, sexual harassment. That is insane. If there is anybody guilty of perpetrating an atmosphere around false rape claims, it is progressive journalists. It is journalists like you. It is journalists. I said like you. It is journalists.
I think that if you are frightened of making a false rape allegation, going to a consent class is quite a good way to have it explained to you in terms you can understand.
How not to rape.
Whether or not you agree with it, it's really good to have all the information about what gets you in trouble.
Do you think boys need to be told how to rape?
Well, if they didn't need to know how to be told not to rape, people wouldn't get raped.
No, that's not true. The suggestion underpinning this is that men exist on this spectrum, that there is toxic masculinity, that if it's allowed to burst forth because it has been inadequately curtailed by the matriarchy, that it can turn into rape, that somehow there is a spectrum on which, you know, touching turns into rape. It doesn't. Rapists don't look like everyone else. Rapists look like rapists. Almost all rapists fall into very specific categories. Almost all of them are repeat offenders. You know, you will not encounter. You know, there is no rape epidemic on campus. And to tell boys that they are all potential rapists by making consent classes mandatory. And by the way, in these consent classes, you won't just hear "make sure she's okay with it." You'll hear. You'll hear that there is a patriarchal conspiracy to hold women down. You will hear that straight white males need to be aware of their privilege. You will hear that, you know, all sorts of extraordinary broadenings of the definition of sexual harassment and sexual assault.
That's just
to
not
the
true.
point.
That's not true.
Well, I sit in these classes and I listen to them, and I've listened to them here and in the United States, and that is precisely what they say. And if you go to these classes, you will hear a variety of toxic feminist myths spat out at the boys in the class, and they are expected to sit there and listen and be told that everyone in the room is a potential rapist. Rape is not a spectrum. You cannot tell somebody not to rape. No rapist is going to not rape somebody because you said, don't rape. These things are primarily directed at men. The vast majority of these things are not about, you know, some lesbian who got drunk and had a fumble, right? Okay. This is not what it's about.
Some lesbian who got drunk and had a fumble.
What's offensive?
It's like,
what? What's offensive about some lesbian who got drunk and had a fumble?
For what starters, you don't know her sexuality.
Yes, I do know her sexuality. It was with a girl. She said so herself.
That doesn't make her a lesbian.
I give up.
Can I just come back on what you said, which is that your perception seems to be that they're pointless because a racist...
It's like that, you know those reports that...
Please let us finish.
Not all women menstruate or something. That is crazy things.
So you're suggesting that I should go to every woman in the UK and give them all...
So to speak. I don't want to let her glib about people's audience. It's sarcastic and glib and patronising. When people are asking serious questions, it's really disrespectful.
For fuck's sake.
Every night in my dreams I see you, I feel you, that is how I know you. Go on. Far across the distance and spaces between us, you have come to show you. Go on. Near, far, wherever you are, I believe that the heart does go on. Once more you open the door and you're here in my heart, and my heart will go on. Love can touch us one time and last for a lifetime and never let go till we're gone. Love was when I loved you, one true time I hold to. In my life will always go on. Near, far, wherever you are, I believe that the heart does go on. Once more you open the door and you're here in my heart, and my heart will go on. You're here, there's nothing I fear, and I know that my heart will go on, 'cause we'll stay forever this way. You are safe in my heart, and my heart will go on.